speakers then, I thought. With regard to questions, I ask that these really are questions rather than profound statements from the audience, because although they may be very worthwhile, we really want to hear as much as we can out of our two guests here, okay? So, let us have some questions from you. And I have one in case nobody asks a question. Do I see a hand up? Yes, in the front row here.
I think that a lot of your work.
Please speak loudly.
Okay. When you started out with UNDP, from the comments I gathered, a lot of your work was more economic, and now you're finding you have to deal with the political aspects of development. How challenging is that, given that you're working sometimes with dictators, from Gabon, Nigeria, my home country? What are the challenges, and how do you address that?
Yeah, did you all hear that? Mm-hmm. I'm glad. I don't want to repeat it.
Well, I think
Okay.
we both have answers since Ken is so heavily involved in these issues. And we have some ongoing debate as to just what the right answer to that question is, because operating in places like Myanmar and Burma, in North Korea, we have a small program in North Korea, Zimbabwe most recently, it's a huge challenge to maintain and represent the values of the United Nations in places where those values are really being degraded by the governments themselves. So it's a process of identifying areas that can affect political development over time, although I leave North Korea out as a possible environment of that sort. But increasingly, there are, partly because of the influence of this country and others, civil society, development of civil society and development of organizations that would like to see representative government grow. And in some cases, the beginnings of parliaments, even under one-party states, in which it's possible to begin to help people develop the kinds of practices of government transparency, government responsiveness. Not all political development depends on having an election, on a regular basis, although, ultimately that needs to be a test of what democracy represents. But it is a difficult challenge in many countries. The job of our country representatives is to figure out, both because they understand the country better than anybody outside the country, but also because by a process of negotiation with the government itself on other areas of development, we're sometimes able to begin to do things that otherwise would be very difficult for other outsiders to do. I would mention in particular the whole area of gender empowerment. It's not always thought of as sort of democratization, but really one of the most powerful things that can be done in any country is to give women the opportunity to participate more in government, even in governments that are less than fully democratic. In fact, in general, I think it's fair to say these days that investing in women in almost any dimension is one of the most powerful ways of creating development prospects, whether it's in women's health, women's education, women's political participation, obviously women's economic development. Microfinance is often a leverage point for creating business that women drive and lead. And so those are all areas that sort of create openings in society, even in some of the most closed societies, that provide an opportunity for democracy to develop. But I would turn it back over.
It's a very good question. It's a tough question, although I would put Gabon and Nigeria in different categories. I would consider Nigeria sort of a struggling, nascent democracy, a weak democracy. Gabon hasn't reached that stage yet. If you divide the world, and just for the sake of dividing the world up, and I can be criticized for oversimplifying, there's sort of three categories of countries. There are those places that are sort of closed societies or extremely autocratic places. You mentioned Burma, North Korea. You can look at other places places where you have an individual or a regime or a junta that controls all aspects of society. Then you have what some people characterize as sort of semi-authoritarian countries, where you have opposition parties, you have civil society, you have media, sometimes independent media, even opposition media. But in fact, the regime controls more or less. You have democratic forms, but not democratic norms in a society. That was Mexico for over 70 years with the PRI, probably Cambodia today, I mean, Hun Sen. You have places like that in Central Asia and the Caucasus. And then you have countries that have gone through a transition, and it is a new democracy, and you have countries that are struggling to make democracy deliver. Because if people don't see these newly created or built democratic institutions responding to the aspirations of the people, then one of two things are going to happen. They're going to go to the streets to solve their problems, or they're going to vote for Hugo Chavez. They're going to vote for somebody that promises to cut out the middle person and have a people's democracy. The UNDP is not a non-governmental organization in the sense that it's much harder for the UNDP to operate in the democracy and governance field in that first category, because it is an intergovernmental organization itself. Regardless of what country they're operating in, they're a member of the United Nations, so they can't be in the country and have an adversarial role with the government. So in those types of places, there are pressing human needs that have to be addressed. And in those places, more or less, the UNDP will focus on those immediate humanitarian needs, which is understandable. Where the UNDP, I think, plays a very important role is that second and third category, and particularly the third category, which I think is the great challenge of our time today, is how do you ensure that new democracies stay democratic and deliver on quality of life issues. So in those semi-authoritarian environments, the UNDP has to operate in a very creative way, looking for entry points that allow it to carry out democracy and governance programs that are meaningful, but doesn't draw the ire of the governments in these societies. And sometimes those are longer term, but not less valuable. And in those new democracies, the UNDP could operate with the blessings of the government because it has a vested interest in making these institutions, consolidating these newly created institutions. And in all of those places, these new governments have inherited terrible legacies. They've inherited poverty, crime, corruption, and disease. And you have these new institutions that have to perform. And it's there that the UNDP can play a very important role in helping to build the capacity of these institutions to deliver, whether it's transparency on extractive industries, where it's HIV/AIDS. And HIV/AIDS is not simply a healthcare delivery system. You need politicians engaged in this, parliaments engaged in this, laws have to be passed, their political will has to be built in these societies. And so there's where the UNDP can play a much more open and vibrant role in those places. So it's not a cookie cutter approach, and in each place, based on their level of development, politically and economically, the UNDP has to adapt.
Thank you.